The late afternoon sun hung low over the Texas frontier, casting long golden shadows across the parched earth. Dust swirled in the dry wind, clinging to the coarse fabric of Clara's simple dress and making the air taste faintly of iron. Her small homestead stood at the edge of a vast prairie, the kind of place where the horizon stretched so far that the sky seemed endless. Beyond the ridge, the Comanche lands began, dotted with distant camps and the occasional plume of smoke that marked life moving cautiously amid the wilderness. Clara, barely 17, moved through the yard with a careful, practiced grace, tending to the chores her mother insisted she learn. She swept the porch with a broom made of twigs bound together, her eyes flicking constantly to the tree line where the wind made the tall grass dance. Though her family had lived here for generations, a thin thread of unease ran through the air. Stories of Comanche raids and stolen horses haunted the elders' conversations, and now those stories had woven themselves directly into Clara's life. She felt it in the tightening of her chest, in the way the wind whispered through the empty branches of the cottonwoods lining the creek. Her father, a wiry man with a sun-beaten face and deep-set eyes, approached her, his boots stirring up puffs of dust. "Clara," he said, his voice clipped with the weight of unspoken concerns, "it's time you understand what's coming. The council has spoken. You'll marry Tayan. It's for the good of the land, of our people, and our family." Clara stiffened, her fingers gripping the broom so tightly the bristles bent under the pressure. Tayan, a name she had heard only in whispers, was a Comanche youth, barely older than herself, but strong and skilled beyond what her sheltered world could comprehend. She had been told he was proud, honorable, and fierce. She had also been told he would be unlike anyone she had ever known. The words meant little to her now. All she could feel was the sudden dizzying surge of fear that swept over her chest. To marry a man she had never met, from a culture so different from her own, seemed impossible and terrifying. Her mother, watching from the kitchen doorway, approached quietly. She laid a hand on Clara's shoulder, a gentle yet firm weight. "I know this isn't what you want," she said softly, her eyes glistening, "but sometimes the land demands sacrifices we cannot ignore. You are strong, Clara. You have always been strong. Strength." Clara had tried to believe she had it, but the idea of leaving everything familiar, the wooden fences she had built with her father, the animals she tended daily, the home she had grown into, felt like tearing away a part of her very soul. And yet, even as terror wrapped around her like a tightening rope, curiosity whispered at the edges of her mind. Who was Tayan? What did it mean to walk into a world she had never known? Her father sighed, turning toward the horizon as if trying to measure the distance between them and the vast Comanche lands beyond. "It's not just about you, child. It's about peace. There have been tensions. The land is scarce, the neighbors wary. This marriage, it is meant to bind our families, to protect what we have." Clara nodded, though she didn't speak. Words would not carry the storm inside her. She went to the well, lowering the bucket and drawing water for the evening meal, each movement mechanical, her mind a whirl of questions and fears. She wondered if Tayan was waiting for her now, somewhere in the endless plains, wondering the same about her. She wondered if he, too, felt trapped, afraid, or resentful of the role that fate had thrust upon them both. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with streaks of crimson and violet, Clara felt a shiver of inevitability. Life on the frontier was harsh and unforgiving. Choices were often illusions, and survival demanded courage she had only begun to understand. This marriage, forced as it was a bridge, one that might connect two very different worlds or crush the fragile life she had known. She gripped the bucket, feeling the rough wood bite into her hands, and let out a quiet breath. Whatever the future held, Clara knew one thing with unwavering certainty: her life was about to change forever. And in the vast, untamed wilderness of the Texas frontier, Change came swiftly and without mercy. The morning of the wedding arrived like any other on the Texas frontier, with the harsh sun climbing over the dry, jagged hills and wind scouring the land as though it were trying to erase the past. Clara's heart hammered in her chest as she stepped onto the rough-hewn porch, the wooden boards creaking under her weight. Today, she would meet Tayan not as a stranger, not as a distant figure in rumors and whispers, but as her husband, the man she had been promised to in a pact neither of them had chosen. Her father had prepared a modest ceremony. There was no church, no priest, only the small circle of family and neighbors who had braved the prairie to witness the joining. Beyond them, the grassland stretched endlessly, and somewhere on the horizon she knew Tayan waited. Her stomach twisted at the thought. She had no idea what to expect. Would he be fierce and proud as the story suggested? Or would he be gentle, cautious, unsure like her? When Tayan finally arrived, the world seemed to pause. He rode a lean, dark horse, his posture rigid and commanding, yet there was a hesitance in his eyes that betrayed the weight of this union. His hair, thick and black, fell in waves that caught the sunlight, and his skin glowed under the morning sun, bronzed and taut from years under the open sky. Clara found herself momentarily lost in the stark beauty of him, and immediately chastised herself for such a thought. The ceremony was brief. There were no vows of love, only the exchange of words dictated by her father's careful negotiation and the Comanche, customs observed by Tayan's family. Hands were joined, eyes met with a strange mixture of defiance and curiosity. Both Clara and Tayan were strangers bound by duty. There was no laughter, no soft glance lingering for comfort, only the taut silence of two people who understood the enormity of what was about to begin. Afterward, Tayan dismounted, and Clara noticed his hands calloused, strong and capable. He nodded at her with a brief, respectful acknowledgement, neither cold nor warm. Clara found herself stiffening, unsure how to respond. Every movement felt foreign, as though their bodies were speaking a language they had not yet learned. For the first few hours, conversation was awkward and measured. Clara tried to ask questions about his home, his family, but Tayan's answers were short, clipped, and careful. She sensed his wariness, the same caution she felt herself. They were learning slowly how to exist together without offending, without breaking the fragile boundaries imposed by obligation. As the day wore on, they were left alone in the small cabin Clara's family had prepared for them. The interior smelled of dry wood and beeswax, a homey comfort that did little to calm her nerves. She busied herself with small tasks, pretending the work distracted her from the tension coiling like a snake in her chest. Tayan watched silently from the doorway, his dark eyes observing her movements, noting her careful grace and the way she moved with a mix of fear and stubborn independence. That evening, as the wind whispered against the cabin walls, Clara found herself seated across from him at a rough-hewn table. Dinner was a quiet affair, each bite deliberate, each glance cautious. Neither spoke of the past nor dared to dream aloud of the future. And yet, in that silence, something subtle began to shift. They were no longer mere strangers. They were two people sharing a space, forced together by circumstance, and slowly learning the rhythm of one another's presence. By nightfall, Clara lay awake in the small bed, listening to Tayan's steady breathing nearby. The world outside was alive with sounds, the cry of a distant coyote, the rustle of grass in the wind, but inside, the cabin was a fragile cocoon of tension and unspoken questions. Fear had not left her. It would not leave her for some time. But curiosity had crept in, unbidden and persistent. Who was this man she was bound to? What thoughts lived behind the careful stoicism he wore like armor? Tayan, too, wrestled with his own doubts. The girl was unlike anyone he had ever known. She was soft yet stubborn, frightened yet resolute. He had expected resistance, perhaps contempt, but instead he found an undeniable spark of life, a defiance that intrigued him. He wondered, for the first time, what it might mean to care for her, to protect her, to bridge the gap between their worlds. Sleep eventually claimed them both, but it was light and uneasy, haunted by the weight of an unfamiliar union and the promise of days to come. The frontier was harsh, relentless, and unforgiving. Yet within the small cabin, two lives had begun the tentative, fragile first steps towards something neither of them had chosen, but both might one day desire. The days following the wedding were marked by an uneasy rhythm. The prairie, relentless in its vastness, offered no comfort, only the constant hum of wind through the tall grass and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Clara awoke each morning with a knot of tension in her stomach, aware that she and Tayan were living together by obligation rather than choice. Their conversations were sparse, polite but guarded, a careful dance around words that might reveal too much or offend too deeply. First conflict came in the form of a simple chore. Clara had risen early to fetch water from the creek, carrying the heavy pail across uneven ground when she noticed Tayan already working nearby. He was repairing a fence that bordered the property, his movements precise, almost ritualistic. She offered to help, thinking it a gesture of cooperation, but Tayan shook his head sharply. "No," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is mine to do." Clara bristled at the tone. She was used to contributing, to pulling her weight on the homestead. Yet here she felt both powerless and constrained, her instincts to participate met with polite refusal. "I can help," she insisted, her fingers brushing the rope she had brought. Tayan's eyes, dark and unwavering, met hers. "You do not understand the way of my people. Some things must be done in a certain manner." The words were not harsh, but the implication stung. Clara's chest tightened with frustration. The world she had known, where effort and cooperation defined value, clashed violently with the customs of a culture she barely comprehended. For the first time, the marriage felt like a wall rather than a bridge, a reminder of all she could not control. That evening, the tension escalated. A sudden thunderstorm rolled across the prairie, dark clouds swallowing the horizon, and rain pounded the cabin roof with relentless force. Tayan had gone to secure the animals, leaving Clara to tend the fires and ensure the provisions were safe. The wind howled like a living thing, and Clara felt a surge of helplessness. She realized with a pang of fear that she relied on Tayan more than she had expected. When he returned, soaked but composed, he found Clara struggling to keep the fire lit. Without a word, he knelt beside her, hands moving deftly to protect the kindling from the rain-driven wind. His closeness startled her. She felt the warmth of his body, smelled the faint scent of leather and earth, and for a moment the walls she had built around herself wavered. "It is dangerous to face the storm." "Alone," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. Clara's lips parted in surprise. She wanted to argue, to assert her independence, but the truth struck her. She had been afraid. Tayan's presence, though commanding and alien, had been a shield. She swallowed her pride, nodding silently, feeling the first trace of understanding between them. Over the following weeks, small conflicts continued to test them. Language, customs, and expectations clashed at nearly every turn. Clara struggled with hunting, learning to ride with the skill Tayan expected and adapting to the routines of his culture. Tayan, in turn, wrestled with her persistence, her curiosity, and her stubborn refusal to yield entirely to his ways. Each argument, each misunderstanding left them frustrated, exhausted, and surprisingly aware of one another in ways they could not yet name. And yet, amid the friction, moments of quiet connection began to surface. A shared glance over a herd of cattle, a wordless understanding when a sudden wind threatened to scatter the provisions, even the simple act of breaking bread together. These small gestures became the threads of trust. Neither dared to acknowledge it openly, but an unspoken bond was forming beneath the surface of irritation and frustration. By the end of the month, Clara began to notice subtle changes in Taeyeon. His sharp eyes softened slightly when he looked at her, and the tension in his posture lessened in her presence. She, in turn, found herself listening more closely to his words, studying his movements and imagining the world as he might see it. What had begun as fear and resistance was slowly transforming into something fragile, unsteady yet undeniable. Respect.conflict, they realized, was not just a challenge, it was a bridge. Every clash, every misunderstanding, demanded that they observe, adapt, and engage with one another. The frontier had tested them both, and it was shaping not just survival, but the faint beginnings of a connection neither could yet name. The prairie was deceptively quiet that morning. The wind was softer than usual, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dry earth, and the sun rose in pale streaks over the horizon. Clara and Taeyeon were traveling to check the livestock, a routine task that should have been uneventful. Yet in the wilderness, even routine carried danger. A sudden rustling in the tall grass caught Clara's attention first. She froze, heart pounding, as the brush shifted unnaturally. Taeyeon, alert as ever, raised a hand to halt her. His eyes, sharp and unblinking, scanned the horizon with a predator's awareness. Before Clara could grasp the full danger, a coyote or perhaps a lone wolf darted from the undergrowth, teeth bared and eyes glinting. The animal was smaller than she expected, yet feral and wild enough to be deadly if cornered. Taeyeon moved swiftly. With a fluid motion, he drew his bow and loosed an arrow that struck the creature with unerring precision. Clara gasped, both in fear and awe. He did not flinch, did not gloat. He simply retrieved his arrow and turned to her with calm eyes. "You should not have come so close," he said, his voice even, almost gentle. Clara felt a mix of embarrassment and admiration. She had been reckless, drawn by curiosity and the need to prove herself. Yet in that moment, she also realized something else. Taeyeon's presence was more than protective. It was steadying, anchoring her in a world that often felt too vast and wild to navigate alone. As they continued, a second danger emerged. A sudden crack of thunder echoed across the hills, and a lightning strike ignited a patch of dry grass near the livestock. Flames licked the earth and panic seized the animals. Clara froze, unable to move, her hands trembling. Taeyeon reacted instantly. He grabbed her by the elbow, steering her away from the blaze with firm but careful guidance. "Stay close," he commanded, his eyes sharp, scanning the fire. Together, they worked to drive the panicked herd to safety, their movements synchronized despite the chaos. Clara realized she had never felt so alive, so aware of her body, her senses, and the man beside her. Taeyeon's stoicism, his quick thinking, and his strength were no longer abstract qualities she had heard about. They were real, tangible, and profoundly human. Later, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, they rested under the shade of a lone mesquite tree. Sweat clung to their skin, dust coated their clothes, and exhaustion weighed heavily on their limbs. Yet in that shared silence, Clara saw Taeyeon differently. He was not only strong and skilled but compassionate in ways his outward stoicism had hidden. He had acted without hesitation to protect her, not out of duty alone, but out of genuine concern. "You are brave," she said quietly, surprising herself with the words. Taeyeon looked at her, his expression unreadable for a heartbeat, then softened. "You are resilient," he replied. Bravery is not only in action, it is in facing fear and still moving forward. The simplicity of his words struck Clara. She had spent her life trying to define courage in terms she understood: physical strength, cleverness, survival, but Taeyeon's understanding was different. Bravery, he suggested, was also about heart, about character, about confronting vulnerability. And in that moment, she realized she had glimpsed the man beneath the warrior, thoughtful, patient, capable of kindness and understanding. For Taeyeon, the encounter had shifted something too. Clara's courage, her willingness to step into danger despite fear, impressed him. She was not fragile, not merely a passive figure to be protected. She was alive, intelligent, and unafraid to meet the world head-on. In the way she had faced the fire and the wild, he saw a reflection of strength. He respected strength that could complement his own. By the time they returned to the cabin, the bond between them had subtly changed. Respect had deepened into something quieter, more personal, a recognition of humanity, of character, of potential companionship. The frontier remained harsh and unyielding, but in facing danger together, Clara and Taeyeon had begun to see one another not as obligation or duty, but as individuals with complexity, courage, and unspoken depth. That evening, as Clara tended the fire and Taeyeon repaired tools by her side, an unspoken understanding passed between them. They were still strangers in many ways, still divided by culture and circumstance, but the first threads of trust and mutual recognition had been woven. In the vast, untamed wilderness, survival was never solitary, and for the first time, Clara felt the quiet relief of knowing she did not have to face it alone. The days following the storm and the cattle scare were quieter, almost deceptively peaceful. The prairie stretched endless and golden under the sun, but Clara and Taeyeon moved through it with a new awareness of one another. The sharp edges of their early interactions had softened, replaced by cautious observation, small gestures, and moments of connection that neither had dared to name aloud. Clara noticed him first in the early morning light, when the dew clung to the grass and mist curled along the creek. Taeyeon was crouched near the water, sharpening the edge of his knife with careful, deliberate strokes. His muscles moved with a grace she had not seen in her father or the neighboring men, fluid, precise, almost hypnotic. The sight struck her unexpectedly. She realized her heart beat faster than usual, a fluttering that startled her more than the prairie wind. She looked away, chastising herself for the thought, yet it lingered, impossible to ignore. Taeyeon, too, was aware of the subtle changes. Clara moved differently now, with confidence born from experience, her eyes clearer, sharper, and unafraid of the world around her. There was a curiosity in her, an intelligence and determination that intrigued him. He had expected resentment, fear, or passive compliance. Instead, he found herself observing him as keenly as he observed her, as if measuring the contours of a new, delicate truth. Their days were filled with routine yet charged with tension. They rode together to check the livestock, hunted small game to supplement their provisions, and mended fences or repaired tools in companionable silence. Each shared moment became a test, an opportunity to learn the rhythms of the other. Hands brushed accidentally over the reins or the rough surface of wood, and each touch lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary. Words that once carried only instruction or command now carried subtle warmth, teasing and hints of unspoken admiration. One evening, as the sun bled red and gold across the horizon, they paused by a stream to wash the day's sweat from their hands and faces. Clara watched him from across the water, noting the taut lines of his shoulders, the way his dark eyes caught the last rays of sunlight, and the quiet strength in his movements. Her pulse quickened. There was something magnetic about him, something dangerous yet compelling, and for the first time she admitted it to herself. She was drawn to him. Taeyeon, kneeling to rinse his own hands, noticed the way Clara's gaze lingered, and a small, unspoken tension stirred within him. Desire, he realized, was no longer a distant concept. It had begun to take shape, threaded through respect, curiosity, and the thrill of shared survival. He felt a magnetic pull toward her, tempered by caution and the weight of tradition, but irresistible nonetheless. As they rode back toward the cabin, the prairie bathed in the soft glow of twilight. The air seemed charged. Words were few, but glances held meaning. Tayan's hand brushed Clara's at the reins, a fleeting touch, yet it lingered longer than necessary. Neither spoke of it, and yet both felt it, the pull, the curiosity, the stirring of a desire that neither had anticipated when this marriage had been arranged. That night, under the faint flicker of candlelight in the cabin, Clara found herself sitting closer to Tayan than etiquette or propriety dictated. She watched the way he moved, silent and deliberate, repairing a leather strap, and felt a warmth in her chest she could not explain. Tayan caught her gaze for a moment and held it, a shadow of something unspoken passing between them. Neither moved to close the distance, but the awareness was electric. Palpable and unavoidable. Desire, they realized, was no longer a distant, forbidden concept. It was growing, subtle but undeniable, woven into respect, trust, and the thrill of the unknown. Each glance, each touch, each quiet moment together strengthened the connection. What had begun as obligation was now complicated by longing, curiosity, and an unspoken acknowledgement of what they might allow themselves to feel if they dared. By the end of the week, Clara and Tayan were no longer strangers sharing space. They were two people entwined in uncharted territory, learning to navigate not only the wilderness of the prairie, but the unspoken wilderness of attraction, desire, and the quiet thrill of closeness. And both knew, in the quiet chambers of their hearts, that the days ahead would challenge not just their survival, but their hearts as well. The prairie that morning seemed deceptively calm, almost serene. The sun rose pale and still, a soft haze drifting across the endless grasslands. Clara and Tayan had been checking the western fence line, their movements now almost instinctively coordinated. The tension that had marked the early days of their marriage had softened, replaced by a tentative familiarity. Yet the wilderness always held surprises, and this day would remind them that danger could strike without warning. The first sign was subtle, a distant rumble of hooves against the hard earth. At first, Clara thought it was the herd returning, but the sound grew louder, faster, and more chaotic. Tayan stiffened, his eyes scanning the horizon with sharp precision. "Raiders," he muttered, his voice low and controlled, but carrying a weight that made Clara's stomach tighten. Within moments, a small group of hostile riders appeared, charging across the prairie. Their intent was clear: to steal livestock, intimidate settlers, and test the defenses of the homestead. Clara froze for a heartbeat, but Tayan's hand on her arm snapped her attention to the present. "Stay close," he commanded. They moved together with a speed and precision born of necessity. Tayan's calm, commanding presence anchored Clara as they guided the frightened livestock toward safety. But one horse, a young Mari, bolted in panic, and Clara realized too late that she had been too close to a rider intent on seizing the animal. The man reached out, and the world seemed to slow. Tayan reacted instantly, placing himself between Clara and danger, his hand gripping her shoulder and pulling her behind him. The rider swung a crude weapon, but Tayan's skill was unmatched. With a fluid motion, he deflected the attack, disarming the man and sending him sprawling into the dust. Clara's heart pounded as adrenaline surged through her veins. She had never felt so terrified, so exposed, and yet so alive. After the confrontation, they took shelter behind a rocky outcropping, the herd secured at a safe distance. Both were shaken, breathing hard, dust and sweat coating their skin. For the first time, Clara saw Tayan's face in close detail, the taut line of his jaw, the intensity of his dark eyes, the faint sheen of worry and relief. He had risked himself without hesitation to protect her, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. "You could have been hurt," she whispered, her voice trembling. Tayan's expression softened, and for a heartbeat, The stoicism that had always defined him melted. "And you would not have survived alone," he replied quietly, his hand brushing against hers in a touch that was both reassuring and electric. The danger, the closeness, the shared vulnerability, it shattered the remaining walls between them. Clara felt her heart open in a way it never had before, her fear giving way to trust, admiration, and a raw, undeniable attraction. Tayan, too, felt a shift within himself. He had always respected her strength, but now he recognized the depth of her courage, her resilience, and the spark that drew him in despite the boundaries of their arranged marriage. That night, back at the cabin, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Both were quiet, each lost in thoughts they could barely admit to themselves. When they sat across from one another by the fire, the flickering light illuminated subtle changes, the softness in Tayan's gaze, the warmth in Clara's expression. The turning point had arrived. Fear had been replaced by desire. Respect had evolved into intimacy, and the fragile connection they had nurtured now had the potential to transform into something undeniable. For the first time, they were not merely husband and wife by obligation. They were two people bound by shared experience, trust, and the stirring of a passion that neither had anticipated. The frontier had forced them together, and in the crucible of danger, it had revealed the truth of their hearts. The weeks that followed the raid marked a subtle but profound shift in both Clara and Tayan. The prairie, relentless and unyielding, seemed less like a threat now and more like a shared challenge, something they faced together, shoulder to shoulder. Danger had forged a bond between them, and in its aftermath, the boundaries of obligation began to dissolve, replaced by trust, respect, and a growing affection that neither could ignore. Clara awoke one morning to the sound of Tayan moving outside the cabin. She dressed quickly and stepped into the sunlight, finding him tending to the livestock with quiet efficiency. The way he worked, precise and confident, struck her with a new appreciation. Gone was the impenetrable stoicism that had once intimidated her. Now she saw a man who balanced strength with care, power with patience. "You handled the herd well yesterday," she said softly, her words carrying a warmth she had not used before. Tayan glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You guided me as much as I guided you," he replied. His tone was light, teasing, yet sincere. It was a small moment, yet it carried the weight of their evolving relationship, an acknowledgement of mutual reliance and equality. Their days became a evolving relationship, an acknowledgement of mutual reliance and equality. Their days became a men moment, blend of work and quiet learning. Clara adopted elements of Tayan's ways. She rode with increasing skill, learned the patterns of the land, and mastered tasks she had once thought impossible. In turn, Tayan began to see the value of her insight, her clever solutions, and the resilience that had sustained her on the frontier. Decisions that once would have been made unilaterally were now shared. He sought her counsel on matters of the homestead, the livestock, and even their modest defenses. Evenings were no longer silent exercises in civility. They shared stories, small jokes, and observations about the land. Laughter, previously rare and restrained, became a regular sound in the cabin. In these moments, Clara realized she no longer felt confined by her marriage. She felt empowered by it. And Tayan, observing her ease and vitality, felt the stirrings of admiration evolve into something deeper, an affection that was no longer born solely of duty or desire, but of genuine connection. One afternoon, as they repaired a fence together, Tayan paused to watch Clara struggle with a particularly stubborn post. Without a word, he stepped closer, his hands guiding hers, teaching her a subtle technique. The proximity, the shared labor, the warmth of his touch, it made her pulse quicken. Their eyes met, and for the first time, there was no fear, no hesitation, only recognition. They were equals, partners in survival and life, and the spark between them had deepened into something undeniable. By nightfall, the cabin felt like a sanctuary rather than a cage. They shared the fire in companionable silence, a quiet intimacy forming in the spaces between words. When Tayan reached out to brush a strand of hair from Clara's face, she leaned into his touch without hesitation. Neither needed to speak. The bond was clear. They had transformed from strangers bound by obligation into partners bound by choice, respect, and desire. Even the neighbors and the occasional visitors sensed the change. Where once they might have seen a rigid arrangement, they now saw a partnership. Clara's confidence and Tayan's steady presence commanded respect, and together they projected a unity that reassured both settler and Comanche alike. In the quiet hours before dawn, Clara often watched Tayan as he moved about the cabin, preparing for the day. She marveled at how far they had come from strangers fearful of one another to a team capable of facing the harsh frontier together. And Tayan, in turn, saw Clara not as the sheltered girl who had arrived reluctantly at his side, but as a formidable, capable woman whose courage, intelligence, and spirit matched his own. The transformation was complete. Their marriage was no longer a social contract imposed by circumstance. It had become a true partnership, forged in the fires of danger and tempered by mutual respect, admiration, and desire. They had both changed, and in the process, they had discovered the rare and precious truth of companionship on the frontier. The prairie had grown familiar to Clara now, each ridge and hollow carrying memories of struggle, survival, and the slow, steady unfolding of their bond. She moved through the land with a confidence that surprised even herself, the weight of fear and uncertainty replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging. The cabin, once a place of obligation and isolation, now felt like a home, alive with warmth, laughter, and the subtle, unspoken rhythms of two people who had learned to share both life and heart. Tayan watched her often, a quiet admiration in his gaze. He had never imagined that the girl who had arrived so reluctant, so frightened, could become his equal in every way. She rode beside him during the morning rounds, her hand brushing his as they guided the livestock, and he found himself stealing glances at the curve of her jaw, the strength in her shoulders, and the quiet determination in her eyes. Desire and respect had grown into love steady, enduring, and rooted in the shared trials of frontier life. Neighbors and travelers who passed through the homestead noted the change as well. Where once Clara had seemed timid and hesitant, now she spoke with authority and assurance, her decisions valued by all who relied on the land. Tayan's presence, firm yet gentle, complemented hers perfectly. Their union was no longer a marriage of convenience, it was a partnership that inspired trust, earned respect, and radiated a quiet, undeniable power. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the prairie in gold and crimson, they rode together to inspect the fences. A soft wind carried the scent of sage and earth, and Clara felt a profound sense of peace. Tayan nudged his horse closer to hers, and for the first time, neither felt the need for words. They moved in synchrony, the rhythm of the land and the animals guiding them, a harmony born of shared experience and mutual understanding. Returning to the cabin, they found the small garden thriving, a testament to their combined effort and care. Clara laughed as Tayan carefully adjusted a trellis, teasing him about his meticulousness, and he responded with a rare grin. There was ease between them now, a comfort that came not from the absence of danger, but from having faced it together and from knowing they could rely on one another in every circumstance. That night, under a sky filled with stars so bright it seemed the prairie itself shimmered, Clara sat beside Tayan at the fire. Their hands brushed naturally, fingers entwining without hesitation. The hardships they had endured, the storms, the raids, the loneliness had shaped them, but they had not hardened them. Instead, the trials had deepened their connection, turning obligation into desire, respect into love, and fear into trust. Tayn spoke softly, his voice carrying over the crackling flames. "We have come far," he said, eyes reflecting the firelight. "Not just across the land, but between us." Clara smiled, leaning her head lightly against his shoulder. "We have," she whispered, "and I am glad we did." The frontier remained as wild and unpredictable as ever, but within the walls of their cabin and in the shared life they had built, Clara and Tayn had found a rare stability. Their marriage was no longer dictated by circumstance, it was chosen, nurtured, and cherished. The prairie, once vast and intimidating, had become a canvas for their shared dreams and aspirations. As dawn broke the next morning, they rose together, ready to face whatever the land might throw at them. Side by side, they were no longer strangers, no longer bound by obligation alone. They were partners, lovers, and equals. Desire had grown into something enduring, tempered by respect and strengthened by experience. In the untamed wilderness of the Texas frontier, Clara and Tayn had found not only survival, but love, and a life shaped by choice, courage, and the unbreakable bond between two hearts forged in adversity.